What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and I want to talk to you about the fight phase today. We're going to do a tactics video talking about some of the most important combat tricks to know in the fight phase of Warhammer 40,000. The fight phase is one of the most flexible and powerful phases in which you can interact with your opponent's units, so knowing these will improve your chances of getting those wins in games of Warhammer 40k. One thing that I do want to preface is that this video is coming in as a little bit of an addendum to an upcoming video that I have on the fight phase. So we'll break down all of the specific mechanics of the fight phase and discuss in a lot of cases why these abilities work. Now we're going to hop in on Tabletop Simulator here to showcase these techniques, and that's going to begin with a technique called combat orbiting. Now, the fight phase has several types of movements that you can do inside it. This includes piling in and consolidating, and all of these types of movements will typically require that you choose a target, usually something that you are engaged with in the case of pile-in moves, and you move towards that target, meaning that the final distance of the moving model from the pile-in target must be closer than it was when you began. So, we have our last Rip Tyranid Prime here, and we want to construct a situation where he has charged this Ballistic Dreadnought, which is in the front of the Space Marine army. The Ballistic Dreadnought has a resilient defensive profile, it's high toughness, it's got a 2+ save, he's difficult to kill. The last Rip Tyranid Prime is not going to do very much damage to him with just low strength attacks. However, he would like to get his 3 damage Rending Claw into these 3 Wound Eradicators over here. However, he could only charge the Ballistic Dreadnought with the charge roll that he got. Now, charges require that they end within 1 inch of the target of your charge. So in this case, we have charged the Tyranid Prime to 1 inch of the Ballistic Dreadnought, and now at the start of the fight phase we are going to perform a pile-in. Now this means that the last Rip Tyranid Prime must pile in towards the Ballistic Dreadnought, but the only requirement is that he ends at a closer position than he began. He doesn't have to move in a straight line directly towards them, he can do what's called orbiting. That means going around the base in such a way that you slowly get closer, but it allows you to basically move almost laterally around them. So in this case, the last Rip Tyranid Prime is going to take his pile-in move to go 3 inches. He's going to end that move 0.6 inches away from the Ballistus, and to elucidate, he could even just go so that he's 0.9 inches away, for example, which would be a legal pile-in. Then he's going to measure his engagement. His engagement is 2 inches, and now, as we can see with one legal pile-in move, he has engaged the Space Marine Eradicators. This then allows him to target them with his attacks. There is no restriction on aiming attacks into models that you did not declare as a charged target. It's also important to note that while you are required to move only towards your pile-in target, there is also no restriction on engaging new enemy units, which could, as in this case allow you to target them with attacks. He can then put all of his smaller, low-strength attacks into the Eradicators, especially his 3 damage Rending Claw, and kill them. Now let's take this same concept and extrapolate it even farther. Now we have a unit with the last Rip Tyranid Prime, and again, this unit wants to get up in on these Eradicators. We want the Tyranid Prime to kill that unit so it doesn't threaten the Tyranid monsters anymore. However, the model in front of them is a Ballistic Dreadnought, something that they don't really want to kill. So what we're going to execute is something called a combat slingshot. It's essentially the same technique that we used previously, but taken to its logical extent. In this case, we're going to use a charge and a pile-in move to send the Tyranid Prime into a unit that we didn't initially charge. So in this case, we have our Hormigons strung out across the length here, and we've declared a charge. We've rolled a 7, so we're going to be able to declare enemies within 7 inches, which does not include the Space Marine Eradicators over here, but does include the Ballistic Dreadnought. We are then going to move all of our models 7 inches towards our charged target, which is going to be the Ballistic Dreadnought. Now, if any of those models can enter 1 inch of the Ballistic Dreadnought with their charge move, or if they can't do that, 2 inches, then they must do so. However, where we have our last Rip Tyranid Prime, because he's not within 9 inches of the Ballistus, he is not going to be able to enter engagement range. So his only movement requirement is going to be moving towards the Ballistus. That means, as we just discussed, the distance between the Tyranid Prime and the Ballistus must be shorter than it was at the beginning of that movement. So in this case, all of these Hormigons are going to come up and move to within 1 inch of the Ballistic Dreadnought, where we are legally required to do so, moving 7 inches as we go. So now at the end of our charge move, we've ended this charge in a legal position. The last Rip Tyranid Prime and his Hormigon unit are in coherency. He moved towards towards his charged target, and everyone who could move to within engagement range or 1 inch of it did so if possible. That ends in a position where the last ship Tyranid Prime is just over 5 inches away from the Ballistus Dreadnought and just within 5 inches of the Eradicators. Now that's important because 5 inches is the magical Goldilocks zone where you can move in 3 inches and engage that target. Now, if the Tyranid Prime had ended within 5 inches of the Ballistus Dreadnought, it would likely be that he would have to move into engagement range of them. However, because he was able to slingshot around the side, essentially orbit around the side of the Ballistus Dreadnought, so he did not enter within 5 inches of it, he now only needs to move towards the Ballistus. Now, it is possible to construct other situations to prevent him from being able to get to engagement range, but today we're just going to do it with distance. You can, for example, place Hormagaunts with your pile-in moves so that there's no physical position for him to enter engagement range, in which case it would also unlock his movement, but in this case we are just going to say that he's outside 5. That means that now when he goes to pile in, he is going to move towards the Ballistus Dreadnought 3 inches, so we just have to make sure that our distance is closing between him and the Dreadnought. He can end up being here. He's now 2.9 inches away from the Dreadnought and within 2 inches of the Eradicator. That then allows him to target those Eradicators with his attacks. Again, we've used that charge move onto a different target to gain additional movement around the edge of that target to then slingshot the Tyranid Prime into melee with a second unit. So now let's go to an example of preserving your models using these combat orbit mechanics and using pile-in moves. We've established a situation here where this Tyranid player has most likely used a combat slingshot to slingshot their last ship Tyranid Prime into engagement of 2 separate enemy units, the Eradicators and the Space Marine Scouts. The Tyranid player has constructed a situation where they're saying, whichever one of these my Tyranid Prime gets to attack will likely die. The Tyranid Prime is a bunch of either 2 damage attacks or 3 damage attacks. He's going to beat the crap out of either one of these units. We've charged the Ballistus Dreadnought in order to construct this situation, and this is the end of the Tyranid player's pile-in step. Now, it is the turn for the Space Marine player to pile in their models. Now, it is the turn for the Space Marine player to pile in their units. They get the opportunity to pile in any unit that was engaged during this step, or during the charge phase. Now, you cannot pile in with a model that is in base contact with an enemy, so if these Hormagaunts have moved and ended base contact with the Ballistus Dreadnought, for example, the Ballistus Dreadnought would not be able to move when it goes to pile in. Same goes for the Space Marine Scouts. The Space Marine Scouts could be selected to pile in. However, if one of them is in base contact with a Hormagaunt, as they are here, they are not eligible to move. However, the rest of the unit is. When you are making a pile-in move, as we've discussed before, you must end that move closer to the target than you started, and the target being the unit you are currently engaged with. Importantly, not the model, the unit. And they move towards the closest unit. This is actually different from previous editions of 40k, so if you're used to older editions, this might be a little bit of a shock, but you measure between the units, not necessarily the exact model. So in some cases, in previous editions, models would have to be magnetized essentially towards the closest model. That's no longer the case. Now they would just move towards the unit. And as we discussed, moving towards means that the distance at the end of that movement must be closer to the unit than it began. This constructs a situation where you don't necessarily have to move towards the closest member of the unit you're piling in towards. So let's talk about these Space Marine Scouts over here. We have 2 scouts, as you can see, that are currently engaged with the engagement zone of the Tyranid Prime. If these guys remain here, the Tyranid Prime will attack them and likely kill the entire unit. So they are incentivized to leave that. Fortunately, the Tyranid player, in order to pin these models in place, has placed a Hormagaunt here. His engagement range looks like this. These Space Marine Scouts can now pile in such a way that they get closer to this Hormagaunt, but move away from the Tyranid Prime. In this case, this guy starts 1.2 inches away. He can pile in this way using a combat orbit, and then, as we can see, is now 1.1 inches away. Same with this guy, who starts just over 2 inches away. He can pile in this direction and ends only 1.5 inches away. Both of those movements are moving closer to the Hormagaunts as a unit, which the Tyranid Prime is a part of. However, they are not moving closer necessarily to the Tyranid Prime. And now, as we can see, this Tyranid Prime's engagement range now has no models within it, meaning that he's not eligible to attack them. That's a legal pile-in and prevents the Tyranid Prime from swinging at the unit. The Tyranid Prime has given himself some redundancy. He will simply attack the Eradicators. But now it is the Eradicator's time to pile in. And here's an important idiosyncrasy of movement rules in Warhammer 40,000. Now, each time you make a pile-in move, you must engage one of your pile-in targets if possible. That is measured or determined on a per model basis, however. And each time you make a move in 40k, you can choose to move models in your unit. You are not obligated to move any of them. So, many moves will impose restrictions on your models if they do execute those moves. However, you're not required to actually do that. So we have this Eradicator right here who is currently engaged by the Tyranid Prime. He's 2 inches away. So he's within 2 inches of the unit, and he is eligible for that Prime to attack him. He doesn't want that, however. Fortunately, there is another Hormigaunt over here. The Eradicator, what the Eradicator is going to do is the same thing we just did over here with these guys, but he's going to shimmy in this direction in such a way that he engages this Hormigaunt, is closer to the Hormigaunt than he began to the Tyranid Prime. He's now outside 2 inches of the Tyranid Prime, but closer than the 2 inches he started with this one Hormigaunt. He has completed all of the requirements of his pile-in move. He's ending in coherency with the rest of his unit, so we have established this as a perfectly legal move. We're then going to go to the rest of the Eradicators and say, I do not wish to move them. If they did move, they would pick up and they would move towards the Hormigons and probably engage the Tyranid Prime. In this case, we are simply not going to do that. We're going to leave them as they were. Now, at the end of this pile-in step, we can see the Tyranid Prime has no eligible targets. He will not make attacks during the subsequent fight phase. We're only going to make attacks with Hormigons into the Ballistic Dreadnought and the Eradicators and the Scouts, and that's going to be it. He is unfortunately left by himself. So this is a technique that you can use in order to escape from attacks from particularly dangerous enemies. If your opponent's unit has either groups of enemies that could attack one of your models, you can sidle away from them in a way that you de-engage a lot of those models. If they have particular special melee weapons in their units, you can try to de-engage the melee weapon models, or especially characters. If you have the opportunity to pile in away from characters towards other models in the unit, you should take that because it will prevent your opponent from making their most powerful melee attacks against you. Now, there is a very easy solution for this if you're trying to defeat this defensive tactic, and that is to base contact the models that your character is fighting. So if the Tyranid player had moved in this way, in such a way that he has pinned several of these Space Marine Scouts with his Hormigons, suddenly these Space Marine Scouts can't pile in anymore, and the Tyranid Prime, they will be locked up for the Tyranid Prime to attack them. They basically get held down by the Hormigons in order for that to happen. You will find some circumstances, however, where this is impossible, where just because of distance or intervening models or terrain, and in those cases, you have to be very careful about where you place your characters so your opponent is not able to de-engage them. Now, I do want to make a note about why this is possible. There is, of course, a rule within the pile-in rules that if you have a model that's engaged with an enemy unit, it must end that pile-in move engaged with that enemy unit. It's not allowed to de-engage enemy units. This is referring to the unit as a whole and not individual models. The Tyranid Prime, in this case, because he's joined to the Hormigons, is not a separate unit. He is part of the Hormigont unit. What that rule means is that when you pile in a model, you must still be within 2 inches of all the enemy units you started within 2 inches of. So let's say we pile in this Space Marine Scout. He's currently engaged by the Genestealers and the Hormigons. It is illegal for him to end a pile-in move engaging only one of these two units. However, there is no necessity for him to end engaging any particular model. So he could pile in such a way that he's only engaging one Genestealer and one Hormigont and not the Tyranid Prime or the other Hormigons, and that is a legal pile in. What you are not allowed to do, however, is pile in so that, for example, your unit could no longer be attacked by the Hormigons at all because they're piling in towards the Genestealers instead. If they started that pile in move next to Hormigons, they have to end that pile in move next to any Hormigont. However, the rules are nondescript as to which of the exact members of the Hormigont unit that he has to move towards. Now, these rules get kind of insane when you're discussing models with an irregular size. So sometimes we're talking about round bases and things, and they're just a round circle. However, things like ovals, or in this case, a frame measuring vehicle, can get really insane when you are calculating pile-in moves. The reason for that is that if this model is not in base contact when it goes to make its pile-in move, it can use pivot to gain additional distance away from models it would be piling in from. So in this case, it would be a little difficult for it if it was just going laterally to de-engage all of these hyper-adapted Raveners. And the hyper-adapted Raveners are anti-vehicle models. They're going to do a bunch of damage. However, because it can pivot, it can change its facing on the fly. It must still end engaging the hyper-adapted Raveners when it goes to pile in, but what it could do is rotate itself to make it very difficult for models to attack it. So let's say, for example, the hyper-adapted had already piled in, and they've slingshot themselves into this position where they have many models engaging the Vindicator. The Vindicator doesn't want to be hit, so what it does, it just goes, I'm going to go towards the hyper-adapted. I have to end within like 1.2 inches or something. So what I'm going to do is rotate myself in this way, something like this. That way, I am now closer to the hyper-adapted than I began. However, I'm now only engaging 2 models instead of all 4 here. Similarly, you could do something where, for example, you went like this. You would end up going closer to the unit as a whole. However, we are sidling out of a lot of these engagement ranges. So we've moved towards the Ravener Prime, who is, in fairness, the scariest model in the unit. But we have de-engaged all of these models and still moved closer to the unit. And that is because we are able to swing our body around in order to make those pile-in moves. Now, it's obviously important that you still do have to end closer. So if he started very close, it's going to be difficult for him to get too far away. But being able to basically drift sideways in order to dodge engagement ranges makes these models extremely squirrely to engage if you don't move into base contact with them. Now, another classic example that I've seen placed in a lot of different places on the internet is if you are engaging a model like this that uses frame measurement and can rotate through a wall, such that most of your models are engaging it sort of at the extent of their engagement range. This guy can then pick up and rotate. He can move closer to the model on the edge here. So we started about 2 inches away. Now we're about an inch away from that one Ravener. But as you've seen, we've used the rotation rules to sling the majority of our frontage out of the engagement range of all of these hyper-adapted Raveners, therefore preserving its life. Again, this can be extremely powerful in the circumstances where it can be accomplished legally. It is important that, of course, you must always be moving towards at least one member of the unit. You must end that movement closer to them than you began it. So there are some restrictions, and as the aggressor, you can prevent this by simply moving into base contact. In some cases, especially if there's intervening terrain, that can be very difficult or impossible, in which case maybe reconsider whether you engage that model at all. But it is something to be aware of in the rare circumstances where it comes up, because this move can preserve this Vindicator's life. He turns around, he shoots back into the hyper-adapted Raveners. He has a giant multi-damage blast weapon. He likely kills them, and that could swing the entire game if you're able to pull this kind of stuff off. So, things to keep in mind when you are playing your games of Warhammer 40,000. Now, before we ramp things up, I do want to bring up a particular clause within the core rulebook that I know is going to get brought up in the comment section. In the fight phase rules, there is a description at the beginning of the chapter that says that units will pile in to maximize the number of models that they have engaged. However, the actual pile in rules don't describe you doing that. This is basically just flavor text and isn't actually rules text for completing a pile-in move. It's to describe what the act of piling in is enabling on the battlefield, but it's not actually telling you what you have to do when you pile in. If that was a requirement of pile-in moves, it would be included inside the pile-in move section of this chapter of the rulebook. However, it's not. I have seen a lot of discussion about that particular clause on the internet, and I just wanted to bring it up here. But with that, those are some combat movements in Warhammer 40,000. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about these, and if you've used these in your own games of Warhammer 40k. Stay tuned for a larger breakdown of the fight phase coming on this channel later on. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and as always, have happy wargaming.